The Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. He describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers, and these are his words. We started then. He with more than 15 pounds of fresh meat, and I carrying the saucepan filled with the meat already cooked. Picard told me that he always liked carrying the food on a march in preference to other things, as after a few days it diminished greatly in quantity. He quoted Aesop as a proof of what he said. As he was talking, we heard musket shots from the opposite side of the lake. "Back! Into the wood," said Picard, but the noise soon ceased and we set out again. The storm, so long quiet, now threatened to break out afresh. Great clouds covered the forest, making it so dark that we dared not enter it for shelter. As we stopped to consider our next move, we heard more firing, this time much nearer. We now saw 2 troops of Cossacks trying to surround 7 of our infantrymen who were coming down a hill, apparently from a little hamlet on the opposite side of the lake. We could see them fire on the enemy and then retreat to the side of the lake, evidently trying to gain the forest, where they could set the Cossacks at defiance. There were more than 30 of the Cossacks. Half of them came down to the edge of the lake opposite to us, to cut off our men's retreat. Our firearms were ready loaded, and I had 30 cartridges ready to receive them if they came over to our side and perhaps to help our men to get off. Picard, who kept his eyes fixed on them, said, "Mon pays, you must load, and I will engage to bring them down like so many ducks. As a beginning, we'll both fire together." Our men, however, continued to retreat. Picard recognized them as the same men who had pillaged the wagon the day before. But now there were only 7 instead of 9. The cavalry were now only about 40 yards off. So Picard, slapping me on the shoulder, said, "Attention to the word of command, fire!" The men stopped astonished, and one of them fell from his horse. When the Cossacks saw this, they scattered, and only 2 remained with the wounded man, who was now sitting on the ice, supporting himself by one hand. Picard, anxious to lose no time, fired a second time and wounded a horse. Then they all fled, leaving their wounded comrade and sheltering themselves behind their horses, which they led by the bridles. We next heard savage cries on our left hand, and saw our unfortunate comrades surrounded by Cossacks on all sides. On our right, we could see the 2 men return for the wounded one, and as he was unable to walk, they dragged him by the legs over the ice. We especially noticed a Cossack on the lookout for us, gazing at the place where he had first seen us. Picard could contain himself no longer. He fired, and the Cossack was struck on the head, for we saw him reel in his saddle, drop his head forward, and with his arms stretched out, fall from his horse. He was dead. At the noise of the shot, the Cossacks who surrounded our comrades turned round, astonished. Our infantry fired at them, and 4 Cossacks fell at once. Then we heard shouts of rage, and a stubborn fight followed. We were just about to help, in a vigorous manner, when the storm which had threatened for so long broke. The snow, which had been falling all the time, grew so thick as completely to blind us. We found ourselves in a thick cloud, obliged to cling to each other to avoid being blown down by the wind. All at once the cloud disappeared, and 6 yards off we saw the enemy, who yelled out on seeing us. We could not fire, our hands were so frozen by the cold, but we faced them with the bayonet and regained the wood, while they galloped off. On entering the wood, we saw the 3 infantrymen pursued by 5 Cossacks from the other side of the lake. We fired on them, but without success, and were beginning again when all at once we saw them sink in the lake and disappear, 2 Cossacks with them. The unfortunate men had passed over the place which the Russians had broken in for their horses, and the new ice was not strong enough to bear any weight. A 3rd Cossack, seeing the others disappear, tried to stop his horse and made him rear upright. The horse's hind legs slipped and he fell over with his rider, and they too disappeared after the others. We were horror-struck, and our pursuers remained motionless on the ice, not attempting to help their comrades. We could hear piercing cries from the hole in the ice, and several times saw horses' heads appear. Then the water bubbled up and spread over the ice. 10 cavalrymen with their commander came up, and approaching the fatal spot, plunged their lances in. Apparently finding no bottom to the lake, they looked over to our side and then galloped off again. We lost sight of them, and all was quiet. We were now left alone in this deserted spot, leaning on our firearms and looking at the bodies of the wretched men. After a silence of some minutes, Picard said, "I have a longing for a pipe. I have a good mind to look for some tobacco among these men. I shall be very unlucky if I don't find any." I said this was an imprudent thing to do, as we did not know where the first of the cavalry had gone to. And as I spoke, we saw a number of horsemen and peasants carrying long poles toward the ice, where the unfortunate men had been engulfed. A cart with 2 horses followed them. "Good be to my tobacco," said Picard. We now thought it advisable to go to the farthest side of the wood. There we found a shelter, probably belonging to a last night's bivouac, where we could hide ourselves and watch the Cossacks. They partly stripped the bodies of our men, and the peasants came afterwards and stripped them naked. I had the greatest difficulty while this was going on to keep Picard from shooting at them. The rest of them, with the peasants, went on towards the hole in the ice and began to make preparations for dragging out the submerged men. When we saw them at work, there was nothing more for us to wait for. It was not quite so cold and might be about midday. We noticed 2 Cossacks patrolling the outskirts of the wood, following our footprints in the snow. At sight of them, Picard flew into a rage and said, "If they have seen us, there is nothing more for us to do. They will follow us wherever we go by our footmarks. Let us hurry on and get into the wood as soon as we can, and if there are not more than 2, we can account for them." He stopped directly afterwards. "Confound them, I had counted on them for tobacco. The cowards, they were too frightened to follow us." We kept as much as possible to the forests, but the fallen trees here and there barred our way, and we had to come out occasionally. Once we looked back and saw the 2 men, one behind the other, about 30 yards off. One of them no doubt saw us as he spurred on his horse, then waited for his companion to come up. We retired into the wood, where we could see them without being seen, and we walked as quickly as possible, sometimes in the wood, sometimes outside, in order to draw the 2 men farther and farther from their companions. After half an hour's walking, we were stopped by a wall of snow ending in a ravine, so we were forced to take a few steps back towards the forest to hide ourselves. The Cossacks were now close to us, but Picard, who knew the art of war, whispered, "I want them at the other side of the ditch. They will be further off from the others." When the Cossacks saw that they could not get through, they went down the ravine so as to come up on the other side of the snow wall. We had, in the meantime, found a passage for ourselves. We took advantage of the moment when they were in the ditch for getting out of the forest, but just as we thought we had got rid of them, and I waited for a breathing space, for my legs were beginning to fail under me, Picard turned his head and saw our 2 friends behind, trying to take us by surprise when we thought they were in front. We re-entered the forest quickly, and making several detours, we returned and saw them walking very softly. Again we took to the forest, running in and out to deceive them, and finally returning to hide behind a group of little pine trees covered with snow. When the first man was about 40 yards off, Picard said, "The honor of the first shot is yours, Sergeant, but wait till he comes nearer." As he spoke, the Cossack signed to his comrade to advance. He turned his horse to the right, facing the bush we were behind. When he was 4 yards off, I fired and wounded him in the breast. He cried out and would have fled, but Picard rushed forward, seized the bridle of his horse, and struck him with the point of his bayonet, saying, "Look out, Montpais, take care of the other." As he spoke, the other came up and discharged his pistol at the head of Picard, who fell under the horse he was holding. I ran at the man who had fired, but seeing me, he threw away his pistol, turned, and galloped off to the plain 100 yards from us. I could not fire at him, as my musket was not reloaded, and with my benumbed hands it was impossible to do it. Picard was now on his feet, but the Cossack I had wounded fell from his horse as if dead. Picard lost no time. He gave me the horse to hold. Walking 20 paces off, he aimed at the other man, sending a ball whistling by his ear, which he avoided by laying himself almost flat on his horse, and then made off at a gallop. Picard reloaded his musket and then said to me, "The victory is ours, but we must be quick. Let us use the conqueror's rights and see if this man has anything for us. We can go off with the horse." I asked Picard if he was not wounded, but he said it was nothing. We would talk of that later. He took 2 pistols, one of them loaded, from the dead man, and said, "I believe he is shamming." I saw him open his eyes. In the meantime, I tied the horse to a tree and took the man's sword and a pretty little case set in silver, which I recognized as belonging to a surgeon in our army. This I hung round my neck, but I threw the sword into the brushwood. The Cossack wore 2 French uniforms under his cloak, a cuirassier's and a red lancers of the guard, with an officer's decoration of the Légion d'honneur, which Picard promptly secured. He wore besides several very fine waistcoats folded in 4, making a thick breastplate, which no ball could have pierced. In his pockets we found more than 300 francs in 5-franc pieces, 2 silver watches, and 5 crosses of honor, all taken from the dead and dying, or from carts left behind. If we had stayed longer, we should probably have found more. Picard picked up his lance and unloaded pistol. He hid them in a bush, and we set off. Picard walked in front, leading the horse, and as I followed, it occurred to me to feel inside a portmanteau fastened on the horse, which I could see had belonged to an officer of cuirassiers of our own army. When I got my hand inside, I felt something very much like a bottle. When I told Picard, he cried, "Halt!" The portmanteau was opened in a couple of minutes, and I drew out a bottle filled with something the color of gin. Picard swallowed some of it without troubling to smell it, and then passed it to me. "Your turn, Sergeant." An exquisite sensation impossible to describe came over me after I had drunk some. We agreed that this was the most precious of all our finds. We must be very careful of it, and as I had in my pouch a little china cup I had brought from Moscow, we decided that it should be the measure each time we drank. We plunged into the forest, and after a quarter of an hour's painful progress, on account of the quantity of fallen trees, we reached a road 5 or 6 feet wide, going precisely in the direction we must take to rejoin the high road where the army must have passed. Feeling now easier in my mind, I raised my head and looked at Picard. His face was all covered with blood. Blood had formed in icicles on his moustache and beard. I told him that he was wounded on his head. He said yes, he had discovered it, when his cap had caught on a branch and blood had flowed down his face. It was nothing of any consequence. And besides, he continued, this is not the time to bother about it. It will do this evening. I proposed that, to get on faster, we should both mount the horse. Let us try, he said. We therefore took off the wooden saddle he had on his back, leaving only a cloth underneath, and we both got astride, Picard in front and I behind. We drank some of our spirit and started, holding our muskets across like balancing poles. We trotted on, sometimes we galloped, often our way was barred by fallen trees, and the idea occurred to Picard to cut down a few more, which looked on the point of falling, and thus to form a barrier against the cavalry if they came after us. He dismounted, and with my axe, he felled some small pine trees across the road, which would effectually provide 25 men with work for an hour. After he had mounted again, we trotted on for a quarter of an hour when he stopped and said, "Coquin de Dieu, this Tartar has a hard trot." I said he was taking his revenge on us for having killed his master. "Ah, Sergeant," he said, "the drop of drink has made you merry. I see." Picard arranged the flaps of his white cloak carefully on the horse's back to make his seat easier, and we went on for a quarter of an hour at a walking pace. Sometimes the horse was half buried in the snow. We now saw a road crossing ours, which we concluded must be the high road, but we had to be careful before entering it. We jumped down, and leading the horse, we retired into the forest in order to examine the road without being seen. We soon recognized it as being the road leading to the Berezina, by the vast number of corpses half covered by snow and footmarks coming towards us. And the traces of blood on the snow looked as if a convoy of French prisoners escorted by Russians had passed not long since. There was therefore no doubt that we were behind the Russian vanguard and that very soon others would come after us. What were we to do? To follow the high road was the only course open to us. Picard's opinion was this. "An idea has occurred to me. You shall be the rear guard, and I the vanguard. I will guide the horse forward if I see nothing coming. You, my friend, with your head turned towards his tail, can look out behind." It was not easy to put Picard's idea into practice. We had to sit back to back, like a double eagle, as he said, with 2 eyes in front and 2 behind. We each took a small glass of gin, reserving the rest for a case of necessity, and we put the horse to a walk, setting off again in this silent and lonely forest. The north wind was bitterly cold, and the rearguard suffered severely from it, hardly able as he was to keep his position. But fortunately, the atmosphere was clear, and one could see objects quite a long way off. The road we followed was also a straight one, so that we had no fear of being surprised at a sudden bend. We progressed in this way for half an hour, when we met in the wood bordering the road 7 peasants, who appeared to be waiting for us. They each wore a sheepskin coat, and their boots were made of the bark of trees. They came up to us, wished us good day in Polish, and seemed pleased to find that we were French. They made us understand that they had to go to Minsk to join the Russian army, as they belonged to the militia. They had been forced to march against us by blows from the knout, and Cossacks were stationed in all the villages to drive them out. We went on our way, and when they were out of sight, I asked Picard if he had understood what the peasants said. Minsk was one of our great depots in Lithuania, containing storehouses of food, and where a large part of the army was to meet. He said he had understood perfectly, and if it was true, Papa Beaupère had played us a nasty trick. As I did not understand, he explained that the Austrians must have betrayed us. He was going on at some length when he suddenly pulled the horse up, saying, "Look out there! Isn't that a column of troops?" I saw something black, which disappeared again, but directly afterwards the head of a column appeared as if coming from a deep hollow. It was easy to see they were Russians. We had just time to turn to the right and enter the forest, but we had hardly gone 4 paces when the horse sank breast deep into the snow and threw me off. I dragged Picard with me into 6 feet of snow, and we had the greatest trouble in getting out again. The brute of a horse got off, but he cleared a passage for us through the woods, and we took advantage of it at once. After 20 yards, we could go no further owing to the thickness of the trees, so we were obliged to return. There was no choice. We found our horse munching the bark of a tree to which we tied him. We went some distance off behind a thick bush and got ready to defend ourselves. While we waited, Picard asked whether our bottle was either lost or broken. Luckily, it was all right, so we each had a cup, which we wanted badly. While I undid the bottle, Picard looked to the priming of our guns and took the snow out of the hammers. After waiting for about 5 minutes, the head of the column appeared, preceded by 10 or 12 armed Tartars and Kalmuks. Some with lances, others with bows and arrows, and peasants to right and left of the road, armed with anything they could lay their hands on. In the center of the group were more than 200 prisoners of our army, hardly able to drag themselves along. Many of them were wounded, some had their arms in slings, others had frozen feet and leant on thick staves for support. Several had fallen, and in spite of the blows from the peasants and from the lances of the Tartars, they did not move. I cannot describe the pain we suffered at seeing our comrades so ill-treated. Picard said nothing, but I feared every instant that he would rush out from his cover at the offenders. Just then an officer galloped up, and addressing the prisoners in French, he said, "Why don't you walk faster?" "We cannot," said a soldier lying in the snow. "And for my part, I would rather die here than further on." The officer said that he must have patience, that carts were coming, and that the most seriously ill would be put into them. "You will be better off than you were with Napoleon, for at the present moment he is a prisoner with all his guard and the rest of his army, and the bridges over the Berezina are cut." "Napoleon, a prisoner with his guard," replied an old soldier. "May God forgive you, sir. You do not know them. They would only be taken dead. They swore it. They cannot be prisoners." "Come," said the officer, "here are the wagons." We now saw 2 of our wagons and a traveling forge filled with sick and wounded men. 5 men were thrown out, whom the peasants at once stripped absolutely naked. These were replaced by 5 others, 3 of whom were unable to move by themselves. We heard the officer order the peasants to return the clothes they had taken to the prisoners most in need of them. As they did not hurry themselves to obey his orders, he gave each of them several smart blows with a whip. We then heard him say to some soldiers who were thanking him, "I am French myself. I have been in Russia for 20 years. My father died there, but my mother is still alive. I hope now that we shall get back to France and our properties there. I know quite well you have not been conquered by force of arms, but by this unendurable Russian climate." "And the want of food besides," replied a wounded man. "If it were not for that, we should be at St. Petersburg." "Perhaps so," said the officer. The convoy moved slowly on. When it was out of sight, we went for our horse, and found him with his head in the snow searching for grass. By chance we came upon the remains of a fire. We relit it, and warmed our frozen limbs. We jumped up every moment and looked to right and left, when all at once we heard a groan and saw a man coming towards us almost naked. He had on a coat half burnt, a dilapidated forage cap on his head. His feet were wrapped in rags, and string was tied round them and round a ragged pair of grey trousers. His nose was almost frozen off, his ears covered with wounds. Only his thumb remained on the right hand, all the fingers had dropped off. This was one of the poor wretches abandoned by the Russians. We could not understand a word he said. When he saw our fire, he almost threw himself upon it. He seemed as if he would devour it, kneeling down in front of the flame without a word. We got him with difficulty to swallow a little gin. More than half of what we gave him was wasted, for his teeth chattered so he could hardly unclose them. His groan ceased. His teeth had almost stopped chattering when he suddenly turned pale and seemed to collapse without a word or sigh. Picard tried to raise him up, but he only lifted a corpse. This scene took place in less than 10 minutes. Everything my old comrade saw and heard seemed to impress him very much. He took his musket and without a word to me, turned onto the high road, as if there was nothing more to trouble about. I hastened after him, leading the horse, and when I caught him up, I told him to mount. He did so without speaking, and I after him, and we pressed forward, hoping to get out of the forest before nightfall. After an hour's trotting, seeing nothing but dead bodies along the road, we came to what we took for the end of the forest. We found, however, that it was only a large clearing in semicircular form. In the center was a fair-sized house, with a few huts around it. This was one of the posting stations, but unfortunately for us, there were horses tied to the trees. The riders came out of the house and formed in order on the road. Then they trotted off. There were 8 of them in white cloaks and very high-crested helmets. They were like the cuirassiers we fought against at Krasnoe in November. Luckily, they went off in the opposite direction from the road we were making for. That concludes the 13th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.